Jedi, yeah, crown me king, tell them heathens.
Shalom, and welcome to another edition here on the Genesis 49ers page, where we say no to vague interpretations and we give thorough breakdowns.
Genesis 49ers, we back but never moving backwards. Here to put Israel on the atlas. Y'all know the slogan. We say no to vague interpretations and we give thorough breakdowns. So we back again as promised, trying to keep the traffic on the channel consistent, the content consistent. We did the Black Sephardi ancestry. Now we're here with the Native Indian slave trade. I want to start moving in this direction and start bringing out more information about Native Indian ancestry, Native American ancestry, First Nationers, what have you, and their important role and their important history and their ancestry, and bring it to the forefront, because there's a myth going around that, oh, Native Indians and Negroes, we have nothing in common. We're not the same people. We're going to shatter those lies here on Genesis 49ers. That's what we're here. We're here to bring forth knowledge and truth, edify and wake up our people out of the deep slumber they're in, and to make this type of education normative amongst our people. That's the problem. These things and these topics are not being taught on a broad level. So we're trying to bring it to the masses. So again, this topic is going to be Native Indian slave trade, a history untold, and a commonality between West Africans and Native Americans. Because a lot of you guys are unaware of the history of the slave trade of Native Indians. You don't think they went on slave ships. You don't think they were sold as slaves. But guess what? Just as the quote-unquote Negroes or the West Africans or the African or the Latinos that came from Spain and Europe, right, were sold over the transatlantic and sold on ships to the Americas and various other places like the coast of West Africa. Because first, we covered in the last video, Sephardi ancestry, you had Jews, Latinos being sold into Sao Tome, the coast of Guyana, West Africa, and various locales. But today we're going to focus on the Native Indians and how the Negroes and Native Indians do have a commonality when it comes to the slave trade. So without no further ado, we're going to proceed to the first slide. First slide, I'm opening up with a banger, Judah and Ephraim. Because you know my channel is Hebraic, right? I started my channel to teach and bring awareness to the Israelite tribes. Amishav, right? Bringing the 12 tribes together. The problem is our people have been taught that they're Indian, they're colored, they're black, they're Negro, they're African American, they're African, so they don't know they're Israel because they're using these modern terms when we're trying to connect to an ancient ethnicity, an ancient race, an ancient tribe of people. If we go back to our ancestors and what they called themselves, we will land back into the territory or the locales of the Israelites. We'll go back to the people of Israel. Now, Judah and Ephraim. Judah was the southern kingdom. Ephraim became the northern kingdom. If you're not familiar with the text. So in all southern colonies, and I'm calling Ephraim primarily the Indian slaves, and I'm calling Judah primarily the Negroes, even though that's not always the case, right? But in all southern colonies, Indian slaves worked the fields side by side with Negroes. I'm going to say that again. Indian slaves worked the fields side by side with Negroes. So you can't tote that myth that, oh, Indians don't have no common ground with us, no commonality. They didn't go through slavery. Yes, they did. It says in all southern colonies, Indian slaves worked the fields side by side with Negroes up to the time of the Revolution, which is around 1776, right? And the source for that is the Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almon Wheeler Lauber, 1880. Page number is 244. And the scripture I'm providing is Judah and Ephraim. And in this instance, I'm saying Judah, Negroes, Indians, or Ephraim, even though that's not always the case, right? Thus says the Lord of hosts, the children of Israel and the children of Judah were oppressed together. And that's what we seen in colonial America. Indian slaves and Negroes being oppressed together. And all that took them captives, held them fast. They refused to let them go. And even to this day, we're still here. And we have not ascended into greatness and became the nation that we're supposed to be. And that scripture is Jeremiah 50, verse 33. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68, one of our most famous and most quoted scriptures as being an Israelite. And if you ever came across any Israelite media, any Israelite literature, I'm pretty sure you're informed about the prophecy of Deuteronomy 28 and 68. We're going to talk about how this applied, or how at least one European looked at this prophecy in relation to Native Indian slavery. So, in the slave trade, right? It says, by the time of King Philip's War, that's about 1675 to 1676, the colonists were well accustomed to the sending of Indian captives. What does that mean, well accustomed? I mean, before this period, since they came to the Americas, because remember, Columbus shipped back Indian slaves to Spain. This became a custom. This was normalized in their culture to take Indians and put them on slave ships and send them over the waters and send them to foreign lands, to send them to other tribes and sell them. So again, it says the colonists were well accustomed to the sending of Indian captives out of the country and to the use of them in their homes. The policy followed toward the Indians captured in this war was the same as that shown in the Pequot War or the Pequot War. Forgive me if I did not pronounce that correctly. It says the captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets. The captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets. So we could actually end it right here. We had, what, 6-7 minutes? But, you know, this wouldn't be Genesis 49ers if I just had 2 or 3 slides. You know, I prepared for you a full meal. So enjoy your meal, feast on what you see. So here it is. So you see that these Indian captives were being sold out of the country and sold into European and West Indian slave markets, or were retained in servitude in the colonies. And in the beginning of the war, Captain Mosley captured 80 Indians who were retained in Plymouth. And in the following September, 178 were put on board a vessel commanded by Captain Sprague, who sailed from Plymouth with them from Spain. In this same year, 1675, Indians, probably from the coast of Maine, were landed as slaves at Fayal, one of the Azores. Now, Azores is off the coast of West Africa in the Atlantic. So they were sold to these islands, right, as captives. And the source for that is Indian slavery and colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Almon Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 125. You're going to learn today. So now, after the completion of watching this video and actually taking notes and writing these sources down and doing your own research, you're no longer going to be ignorant to the fact of the native Indian slave trade. Because a lot of people are ignorant. And a lot of people say, oh, well, Indians didn't go through slavery. That's BS. But let's move on. Sold to the Azores. So let's see what the Azores are. These are the Azores Islands. Again, it's off the west coast of Africa, or you can say off the coast of Europe, whatever. It's in the Atlantic, right? Between America and Africa and Europe. It said that the Azores Islands are located on the west coast of Africa. The Native Indians were being displaced to the areas far from the Americas. And that's what happened. They were being sold out of the country on the ships just like their West African brethren. Understand that. There's a commonality there. Just like your brethren. Why is this not being taught on a mass level or a mass scale? Because this would bring us together. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to do and accomplish here with Genesis 49ers and bringing forth this truth to bring us together? Gather yourselves together, right? So moving on. Oh, nation not desired, because you know everybody throws salt on our nation, but it's time that we rise to the nation that we were foretold to be. So let's deal with the transportation of slaves. Again, in 1675, 15 Indians were captured and sent to Boston, tied neck to neck like galley slaves. What are they referencing galley slaves from? They're referencing what we all know as the transatlantic slave trade, right? Much against the will of the populace, they were given trial. All were finally acquitted except 2 were sentenced to be sold out of the country as slaves. Sold out of the country as slaves. During the years 1675 and 1676, one finds mention of the sale of Indians in Plymouth in groups of about 100, 57, 3, 160, 10, and 1. From June 25th to June 25th, year 1675 to September 23rd, 1676, the records show the sale by the Plymouth colonial authorities of 188 Indians. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, a similar disposal of captives was accomplished. On one occasion, about 200 were transported and sold. There is a paper written by Daniel Gookin in 1676, one item of which is as follows: a list of the Indian children that came in with John of the Pocatougie. The list shows 21 boys, 11 girls distributed throughout the colony. Again, this is more proof and evidence of them transporting slaves, having a established Indian slave trade in the colonial America. And the source is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Almon Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 126. Again, slave ships, right? Let's deal with slave ships because, again, this is a commonality. Negroes, West Africans were brought on slave ships and put into servitude and slavery. Native Indians were brought on slave ships and put into servitude and slavery. It says, with the close of the war after King Philip's death, many of the Indian chiefs were executed at Boston and Plymouth, and most of the remaining chiefs with their captive followers were sold. Listen clear here. Be attentive. It says were sold and shipped off as slaves outside the colonies. They were sold and shipped off as slaves outside the colonies. Those transported were carried to various parts: the Spanish West Indies, Spain, Portugal, Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores, right? So they were transported and they were scattered, just like the scriptures say. It should be scattered in all nations, right? So the source is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Almon Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 126 to 127. So we can show them on slave ships, and we know Deuteronomy 28, as we brought up earlier and mentioned earlier, references that the Israelites will be sold on slave ships into bondage. Again, here's the prophecy of the Indian slave trade, referencing Deuteronomy 28 and 68. Again, it says, Drake's note in the Hubbard, page 94, these Indians did not sell well abroad in one instance. When no immediate market could be found, a number of them were left in a slave market in Algiers. Now, Algiers is in North Africa, right? So they came from the Americas and were being sold in slave markets in North Africa. And the Massachusetts Historical Society Collection, Series 1, page 183. Of this incident, Cotton Mather said, moreover, this prophecy in Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, the Lord shall bring you into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt not see it no more again. And that not see it no more again is speaking of your homeland or your territory. And it's in there, you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. These did our Eliot imagine were sent to be sold in the coastline not far from the coast of Egypt and on the Mediterranean Sea, and scarce any chapman would offer to take them. And the Magnalia, book 7, book 52, part 3 is where they were getting that quote from. And he basically interpreted, oh, they came over here, they didn't sell well, so they fit the prophecy, which would be incorrect. He's correct, but he's incorrect on the part about them not selling well, because the prophecy says to be sold, and you shall be sold. To be sold means the purchase has already been made. A lot of people misconstrue the end of Deuteronomy 28 where it says no man shall buy you. That's referencing no man shall buy you your freedom. Because when you look into the Levitical law in chapter 25 of Leviticus, it explains that you could redeem or buy your brother out of freedom. And we all know that we had to just stick slavery out until, it was abolished. But anyway, the source for that is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. I'm on Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 127. So you had Cotton Mather, who saw the Indians being sold as slaves in Algiers in the Mediterranean, and he was like, oh, they're fulfilling the prophecy, just like we say today. These people fulfill the prophecy found within the holy text. So let's deal with the Inuits. The Inuits kidnapped, because the Inuits are the like Canadian tribe, Alaskan tribes of quote-unquote Native Indians, but the Canadian government, I believe, titles them First Nationers, which will be more accurate, right, and more appropriate and less offensive in my opinion. So it says one should add that the Netherlands today is home to a large numbers of persons of American race from Suriname, Caribs, and Loconos, as well from Aruba and nearby islands. This is in addition to many mixed persons from the same regions. The northern countries, and especially Denmark, have been more affected perhaps by Inuit contacts with Europe, since the Inuit story is somewhat distinct from the rest of America. As discussed, there is strong evidence for Inuits from Greenland being kidnapped or otherwise carried to Norway long before 1492. Now, this information is in obscurity. You don't hear about this. But you had Inuits being kidnapped long before 1492 and brought to these parts of the world, like the Netherlands. It said it is very likely that the many European vessels reaching Newfoundland and Greenland areas after 1500 were occasionally able to kidnap Inuits. So this will be also a part of the Indian slave trade. And the source on that is the American Discovery of Europe by Jack Forbes, page number 178. So we have a million slaves transported. Because some people say, oh, well, we acknowledge that there was Indian slaves, but it wasn't. It was insignificant. All right, let's see. It says, my last observation on the savagery of these brutes is this. Over the 16 years since first they arrived in the region, they have sent shipload after shipload of natives for sale in Santa Marta or on the islands of Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. And all they must have dispatched more than 1 million of them. More than 1 million slaves being transported from their homelands and dispatched to another place and sold as slaves. And the source for this is Destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas, page number 101. So we have the historical documentation as an attestation of these slaves being transported and sold. This is building that commonality and bridge between Native Indians and quote unquote Negroes here in America, man, and West Africa. Beltran Nuno de Guzman. In 1525, in the wake of the barbarity, and carnage we have described and of yet further atrocities committed in the provinces of New Spain and Panuco, there arrived yet another butcher who was to be responsible for outrage upon outrage in Panuco province. He, Beltran, it was who saw to the depopulation of the entire province, for he took to branding any number of free men as slaves, in the same way as we have seen others do before him, and in bundling them on vessel after vessel for transport to the island slave markets of Cuba and Hispaniola, where they would fetch a better price. So you see more evidence, right, of Indians being captured and sold as slaves with slave ships and vessels, right? Sea vessels, which are slave ships. And the source for that is the Destruction of the Indies Bartolome de las Casas, page number 65. Brazilian traffic. The enslavement of Brazilians was a continuing process in both the South and the Amazonian region. Between 1630 and 1650 alone, 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from Paraguay, the Paraguay region, were captured and sold to various places. As late as circa 1710, the Portuguese of the Piauí region were trading away 3 or 4 Americans for 1 African from Angola. A Jesuit estimated that 3 million Indians, listen to this, 3 million Indians were descended as slaves from the Rio Negro along in the country up to 1750. So this is how impactful this Indian slave trade was. You had over 3 million that were descended as slaves as a result of this trade. It says this figure is perhaps exaggerated, but nonetheless, it indicates that very large numbers of Americans were available for resale to Europe, the Caribbean, Cabo Verde or Cape Verde, and other areas. It only ignored descendants of male Americans, but left many classes of semi-slaves still available for the exploitation. In point of fact, the trade in indigenous slaves continued on in the region between the Amazon and Suriname until at least the middle of the 19th century. So that's how long it lasted, at least to the middle of the 19th century. This is why we have to speak about this, because a large chunk of history is being ignored. But here in Genesis 49, as we hear to restore the walls of David. So anyway, source is The American Discovery of Europe by Jack Forbes, page number 172. If you don't know who Jack Forbes is, he basically dedicated his life and studies to the Negro or African and Indian relationships, right? He basically wrote works tying those two together. Moving on. A PhD. Keep that in mind. Indians in Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal. It says many Americans ended up in Lisbon, Algarve, and other sections of Portugal. References in records from Lisbon refer to American captives. In 1550, special places along the river were set aside both for Indian males and Indian females, along with the other people of color, so that they could sell water to residents in the city. In 1591, a confraria or organization existed for Indians living in Lisbon. And the source for that again is American Discovery of Europe, Jack Forbes, page number 172. Native Indians' presence in various places, because that's what will happen if you have a slave trade. You will have mention of these Native Indian captives or slaves or descendants of slaves in various places. So here we go. The quote says, we can document their presence in cities such as Valencia, Sevilla, and Lisbon especially, but it's more difficult to know how many were resold to Baltic and other sections of Europe. I believe that we can be sure that Americans were traded widely in the Mediterranean region, not only in areas possessed at times by Spain, such as Italy and locations in North Africa, but also wherever Spanish, Portuguese, Genoese, and Tuscan and Venetian merchants plied their commerce. It would seem especially likely that Americans might have been transshipped to Sicily and Naples during the Spanish domination of that region. But since many or all Americans, which is talking about Native Indians, would have been classified as non-Christians, They might have fallen into the hands of the Iberian, Jewish, and Muslim merchants and become part of the North African, Middle Eastern, Ottoman captive trade, especially during times of relative peace between Portugal and Spain on the one hand and Muslim and Greek Orthodox regions on the other. The Low Countries, Belgium, and the Netherlands, along with other parts of Europe, became associated with Spain during the Habsburg ascendancy. It seems likely that Antwerp might well have become a place where American captives would have been resold and from whence they might be transferred to other Habsburg domains. Significantly, Antwerp figures in the lives of Sir Thomas More, author of Utopia, and other pre-Enlightenment figures. The period from 1493 into the early 1500s will most likely be the period of the heaviest shipment of Americans, referencing Native Indians, to Spain. We do not have records of every vessel's cargoes, but it can be estimated conservatively that up to 800 captives were transported each year from 1494 for about 10 years. The total that we can document is in the range of 4,000 from 1493 to 1503, but the records are very incomplete, and 8,000 is a more likely figure. So we covered what? That Native Indians were being traded to the Baltic regions, Spain, Antwerp, which is in Denmark, I believe, or Holland, and various places, right? And we went over the history from 1493 to 1503 of how many slaves and the heaviest shipment of Americans or Native Indians to Spain. And that source is American Discovery of Europe by Jack Forbes, page number 168 and 169. The historicity of Spain's slaves. During the 16th, early 17th century, Spain was home to from 100,000 to 300,000 captives. If a mere 10% of these were American, meaning Native Indian, that would yield a total of 10,000 to 30,000, a quite possible number given the continuing importation of Brazilians from the early 1500s and continuing into the 18th century. In 1516, for example, 88 Negroes, 85 of whom were Americans from Brazil. Why? Because earlier, we're going to cover later in this video, Native Indians were being called Negroes as well. But I digress. Back to the quotation. It says, were imported into Valencia. In the period from 1569 to 1620 of listed slaves in Valencia, 22 were specifically from Brazil, Las Indias de Portugal. This number compares well in significance with 12 from Cabo Verde, some of whom could have been American or part American, 23 from Sao Tome, and 23 from Angola. American captives in Spain were both sexes and usually young. As mentioned above, some women were pregnant upon arrival, while other women are mentioned specifically as having children or infants with them. Females are common. It would seem that many appear to have married Spaniards, as is reported, especially for the towns of Ayamonte and Gilberto Leon, located near the Portuguese border. Nonetheless, there are cases where males seem to be more common, as in Las Palmas, the Canary Islands, where 17 Americans were sold between 1537 and 1600, of whom 14 were males from age 6 to 48, and at least 5 were from Brazil. A cacique from Mexico is specifically mentioned along with one of Augustine's English, condemned for his sexual perversion. Perhaps the latter male was from an English-speaking region, hence his name. As late as circa 1650, 3 female American slaves were donated to a nun living in a monastery in Spain. So what we're unraveling more history now of Native Indians being taken from places like Brazil and brought over to Portugal and locales in Spain. So you cannot deny the Native Indian slave trade no longer. We see it. And it's a commonality between West Africans, Negroes, and Native Indians. And the source is American Discovery of Europe by Jack Forbes, page number 170 to 171. Moving on. The daily life of captives. The lives of Americans in Spain probably varied considerably. And remember, when he says Americans, he's talking about Native Indians or Native Americans. Many women doubtless served as domestic labor or as concubines or wives for Spaniards. Males sometimes were assigned to the galleys. One Benjamin fled from his owner, a dyer of Sevilla, and was subsequently jailed. Another American was condemned to the galleys for committing a robbery. The people of color of Sevilla were allowed to organize their own communal lives, centered, it would appear, around the sections of the city called Triana. To a degree, at least, they were allowed to regulate their own marriages, celebrations, and social life under the supervision of an African governor of royal ancestry. They were also able to organize fraternal groups through the Roman Catholic Church for burials, funerals, and so forth. Thus, although they were captives and their labor was prescribed, they also were able to gradually merge into the proletariat of Spain and probably into the Gitano gypsy grouping, the Carlos-speaking population. I personally have met Gitanos in Spain and Portugal who appear to me to have American or Native Indian facial characteristics. Jack Forbes likes to say American because he believes that title would belong to them because they are the original Americans from his standpoint and his perspective. Source: American Discovery of Europe, Jack Forbes, page number 171 to 172. So, now let's deal with the colonist slavery. It says, a comparison of these prices be paid for Indian slaves shows much variation at different times and places. In New England, after the Indian Wars, the prices were low, for the chief object of the government was to get rid of the captives. In localities where the Indians' labor was in greater demand, the prices rose and appeared to have been highest among the English of the southern colonies. When compared with sums paid for Negroes at the same time and place, the prices of Indian slaves are found to have been considerably lower. In general, the prices of slaves increased during the years preceding the Revolution, but the values of the Indian slaves did not equal those of Negro slaves. During the existence of Indian slavery, furthermore, there was never any general expression of opinion regarding either in England or America, nor are there many records of opinions expressed during the colonial period as to the right or wrong of enslaving the natives. The English colonists followed the Spanish custom of reducing the Indians to a condition of slavery. So just like the Negroes, they went through the same thing. And real quick, a sidebar on the prices. Of course, Indian prices, like I said earlier, would be cheaper because they were just trying to get rid of them because they was making them captives. And also, versus it's cheaper to get a slave from the homeland or from the mainland than to get a slave imported from Africa. So of course, the prices would not be exact and the same. It says, but neither the English colonists, let me start over. The English colonists followed the Spanish custom of reducing the Indians to a condition of slavery. But neither the English colonists nor the English government heeded the example of the later policy of the Spanish government in looking upon Indian slavery as unjust and declaring it illegal. The source is Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almon Wheeler, Lauber, 1880, page number 302 to 303. Evidence of Native Indians in Spain. It says the Americans in rural areas probably were engaged in agricultural labor or in small towns and various trades. They lived in a Spain where hundreds of thousands of Muslims were forced to abandon their homes for exile in North Africa, while other Muslims were eventually forced to become Christianized. Surviving Jews were all forced to be new Christians. Nonetheless, many rural regions and proletarian urban areas must have been rich in diversity, with African and American attitudes towards life, sexuality, and spirituality having an impact beyond the eyes of church and government. One custom that appeared was that of the use of tobacco for smoking, a habit that eventually spread to a large percentage of Spaniards of all classes. So the fact that early Europe and Spain had tobacco leaf and was smoking it is a testament to the fact that they had a bunch of native Indians being transported over there, because that's how it spread through Europe, because tobacco is native to what? The Americas. And the source for that is American Discovery of Europe, Jack Forbes, page number 171. So now let's deal with the Indians that were used as commodities. Indian slaves were made a source of income to their owners by hiring them out to work in the same way as Negroes. So just as they treated the Negroes, they treated the native Indians and indentured white servants. It says the colonial laws and some made provisions for such use. A South Carolina law of 1712 permitted an owner to hire out his slaves by the year or for a shorter time and receive their earnings. The provision was repeated in the Acts of 1735 and 1740. Maryland in 1753 provided that masters of ships might hire servants or slaves from their owners. New York City in 1731 made provision for owners hiring out Negro and Indian slaves. Since the custom was common in its application to other servile classes, one may believe that it was followed in other colonies beside those which made legal provisions regarding it. The use of Indian slaves in military operations was not infrequent. In the New England Wars, Captain Church employed Indian captives against the enemy, a plan which he found serviceable on several occasions. This use of Indian as well as Negro slaves for military purposes was advocated in 1666 in a narrative addressed to the Duke of Albemarle. And the source for this is Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States. Almon Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 245 to 246. So we're seeing that they were sold, used as commodities, just as the Negro slaves. They were used in a war. So we can see the comparative nature. We can compare and show that commonality once again. And we'll continue to do that throughout this presentation. Now, let's deal with Georgia's history. The early history of Indian slavery in Georgia is so bound up with that of Carolina, the Indian Wars, and the difficulties with the Spaniards of Florida, as to require but little special attention after the settlement of Georgia as a separate colony. Occasional mention is made of the Indian slave. In 1759, as the basis for a tax bill, the number of slaves was placed at 2,500, but a committee of legislature declared the number to have been underestimated. How many of this number were Indians is not known. The colony was settled at the time when Indian slavery was passing out of existence, so it is safe to state that the number of such slaves was small. The number of Indians in Virginia also was small, owing largely to the number of indentured servants and to the early introduction and fitness of Negroes for labor of the colony. In 1671, Berkeley reported the whole population of the colony as 40,000. The number of indentured servants as 6,000 and that of slaves as 2,000, but no division of slaves according to color was made. In certain sections, but few slaves were used. So they just said they had slaves. They didn't say, oh, this is the type of slave. This came from West Africa. This came from the mainland. So these were just an amalgamation of slaves. It says the Scotch, Irish, and the Germans preferred their own labor to that of slaves. Some Indians were taken in war, but they were inconsiderable when compared with the number captured in the Carolinas. Occasional mention of Indian slaves is found well into the 18th century. Indian slavery in Massachusetts began early. Following the Pequot War, 1637, 48 captives were retained as slaves in the colony. After King Philip's War, 1675, also certain of the captives were made slaves, but no record exists of the exact number. The various records and histories of the Massachusetts towns show a general of Indian slaves throughout the colony during the colonial period, such as existed following the two Indian Wars above noted. Mere mention may be made of some of these: Plymouth, Boston, Roxbury, Ipswich, Quincy, Charleston, Malden, Haverhill, Milton. None of the official reports on the condition of New England makes mention of Indian slaves. So, real quick, as if there was like a blockade of information about this, but that, again, that's what the point of this channel is here for, to unravel the obscurity and the darkness of this history and bring it to light. Remember, everything that's put in the dark shall come to the light, and we the messengers of light. So, again, Genesis 49, we say no to vague interpretations, and we give thorough breakdowns. So the source is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Alman Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 168 to 169. Practically enslaved by the monks. Because some of you guys are watching maybe from the Christian orientation, and you, oh, well, the Christians didn't, when they came amongst the Indians, they just baptized them, they didn't do them no wrong. Well, we're about to find out the truth on that. It says these large numbers of barbarian neophytes were presided over each of the mission by a very small number of monks who directed the religious and industrial activities of their Indian charges. It was necessary that a mission should be self-supporting. The Indians gathered at these centers voluntarily and submitted to the touring life of the missions. But the natives were ignorant and incapable, and the monks were in consequence the directing and guiding force among a population which responded in a mechanical sort of way. The natural result was that the mission life developed into a kind of slavery. So they took the Indians and enslaved them and made them work for free. But I'm just going to let what's written in black and white prove itself, right? So let's continue on with the quotation. It says the life of a California mission through a latter date and more fully developed than the earlier missions of colonial times affords a picture of a general condition of affairs. The Indians constructed the buildings, planted and cultivated the fruit trees and vineyards, tended the cattle, made pottery, wove clothes, and performed, in fact, all the manual labor that was necessarily required in the extensive colony. In return, they received food, clothing, and lodging, were instructed in the church doctrines and observances, and were taught dancing and music and occasionally the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their life was a regular routine, and though material comfort was generally in evidence, still the Indian neophytes were never allowed to act on their own initiative. Beyond their existence from day to day, they received no pecuniary reward for their labor, so they wasn't paid any more than if they had been slaves. The monks just turned them into slaves. Look, build this. Here, construct our communities, plant and cultivate our gardens, pick our fruit, tend to the cattle, feed the cattle, brush and clean the cattle, make our pottery, wove our clothes. They forced our ancestors to do all this stuff for free. That's slavery. That good old Christian monks, right? Source: Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Alman Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 60. Again, we say no to vague interpretations and give what? Thorough breakdowns. So that we're thoroughly breaking down this topic. I know we're about 43 minutes in. Bear with me. Grab your notepad, your pen, take notes, absorb this information. Moving on. Now let's deal with the plight of the native Indian slaves. The Indians of the missions were generally tractable, but occasionally the desire for their former life of freedom brought reaction and rebellions, or incited and aided by the wild tribes, they rose and destroyed the missions. The revolt of the Pima in 1750 is a case in point. The alcaldes, or local officials to whom the king had entrusted the protection of the Indians instead of protecting them, preyed upon them for their own profit. These men, like many other colonists themselves, were often an inferior class and too far from the central government to feel any special fear at disobeying the laws that the home government might make with regard to the natives. Accordingly, the Indians were often induced to run into debt, and had in consequence to mortgage or sell whatever property they possessed. They thus became subject to whatever impositions the officials chose to put on them. So, real quick, another sidebar. I've been giving you guys a lot of sidebars, but a lot of people say, well, when they came over here, they conquered them fair and square. They won. They engaged in war and won. That's how they took the land. This is not fair and square. They ran these people into debt. And then they had to sell their homes and everything. And then they fell into servitude because they had nothing else. These people that did this were evil. There's no excuse for it. When you make excuse for it, you are siding with the enemy. And let me continue on. It say, they thus became subject to whatever impositions the officials chose to put upon them. In 1792, Fray Juan Agustin de Morphy complained to the Viceroy of New Spain that from each pueblo in their respective jurisdictions, the alcaldes in Texas were accustomed to levy weekly contributions of produce, that they required the Indians to perform free labor upon their estates. What's that? Slavery. Free labor, that's slavery. It says that they demanded heavy tolls from each pueblo at harvest time, that the Indian women were forced to grind the alcalde's grain, that some officials required tithes of fleeces and compelled the Indians to weave them, and that the Indians had to serve as mule drivers and care for animals of the alcaldes. The attitude of the alcaldes toward the Indians, furthermore, was repeated by the officials of the presidios, or frontier post. That's in Texas. That's how they treated it. They were enslaved. The native Indians were enslaved. And the source for that is in the title, Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States. Almon Wheeler, Lauber, 1880, page number 61. Now, let's give more clarity on the native Indian slaves. American Indians are largely absent from the conventional discourse on American slavery. That's what we talked about earlier. This is an obscure history. You never really hear about it. It says much attention has been given to their role as slaveholders and slave catchers, because most people say, you're saying you're related to Native Indians. They had slaves, but they also treated the slaves well and they freed them. You don't want to bring that part out. You put more attention on that, but you ignore the fact that they were slaves themselves. They were robbed of their land, their homes, and then put into servitude and sold into different countries and different locales. Much attention has been given to their role as slaveholders and slave catchers, yet they were also the victims of chattel slavery. This is that common history I was talking about earlier. As numerous Virginia legislative statutes illustrate, Africans were not the only slaves in Virginia, or in the United States for that matter. Nevertheless, the association between black people and the enslavement in American culture has become instinctive, natural. As the late Sioux scholar Vine Delores stated, it is fortunate that we, Native Americans, were never slaves. We gave up land instead of life and labor. However, nothing can be further from the truth. The peculiar institution comprised a multiracial population that included American Indians. Land dispossession, disease, and war indeed contributed to the decline of the American Indian population, but the American Indian slave trade was also instrumental in the decimation of native peoples, as Charles Levasseur reported in 1700. The greatest traffic, listen to this, is right here, is prolific. Listen, it says the greatest traffic between the English and the savages is the trade of slaves, which the natives take from their nations, whom they war with continuously. This greatly destroys the nations which are our neighbors. So you had Native Indians warring with each other. They would get slaves, and the greatest traffic of these slaves was between the English and what they call savages, taking Indians from different locales and trading them. What does this sound like? What happened in West Africa? Like the Dahomey tribe taking other West African tribes and selling them to the quote-unquote white man. Let's read on. It says the slave population in the Americas underwent 3 stages. During the first state, the slave population was comprised of American Indians. During the second state, the population was comprised of Native Americans and Africans. And during the third stage, the population became more Africanized in regions like the Atlantic seaboard of North America. This in turn obscured slavery's American Indian origins, as well as the origins of numerous people of American Indian or part American Indian ancestry who remain entrapped in peculiar institution. And real quick before I give you the source, like I've been saying, a lot of you people that are identifying Negroes, African Americans, a lot of y'all are Indians and don't even know it. Oh, I descend from slaves. Okay, you descend from slaves. A lot of those were Indians. A lot of those were Indians. But anyway, a lot of y'all watch the Aboriginals. Oh, they're crazy. Negroes, Indians. There's evidence behind that. And we're going to get into it. The source, it says, that the blood stay pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 72. Again, this is where it gets juicy. And we went over the slave trade, them being sold to other countries, the colonial Indian slaves, their treatment in Georgia and various locales. Now we're going to deal with what I call the Negro Indian confusion. Remember, I called the Negro Judah, Ephraim the Indian, but that's not always the case, right? But we're just using it as a generality. So in all southern colonies, again, we're going to bring this up. In all southern colonies, Indian slaves worked the fields side by side with the Negroes up to the time of the Revolution, 1776. And the source for that is Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 244. Real quick, that is a great source for this topic. You buy that, you purchase that book, you basically purchase a large amount of history regarding this topic. It says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the children of Israel and the children of Judah were oppressed together. The Negro and Indians were oppressed together, and it's prophecy fulfilled, right? And it says, all that took them captives held them fast, and they refused to let them go. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 33 is where you can find that prophecy. Moving on. Now, let's deal with the Negro classification. It is impossible to estimate the number of Indian slaves in any given English colony since, among other factors, extant Indian slaves either receive no mention or are classed with Negro slaves without distinction. A lot of these Indians were identified as Negroes. So it would behoove you, or it would be a logical conclusion and safe to surmise that a lot of Negroes walk around today descend from those Indians. Get out of that binary color code stuff. Oh, you're either black or white. You're black or white. If they don't look like me, then you don't understand. But we're bringing it to the light. What's in the dark shall be brought to the light, and we're bringing this history, and we're enlightening you today. Here on Genesis 49 is where we say no to vague interpretations and give thorough breakdowns. So back to the quotation, it says, nevertheless, colonial records provide some clues regarding the impact of the Indian slavery within the colonies. New England and the southern colonies had considerable concentrations of Indian slaves. Indeed, to the economic structure of the South, it is not surprising to find that the highest concentration of American Indian slaves were found in the southern colonies. And that source is that The Blood Stay Pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 73. Now, still with the mulatto classification. In one colony, Virginia, the term mulatto was made to include Indians by the Act of 1705, which provided that the child of an Indian should be deemed, accounted, held, and to be a mulatto. So a lot of times when you saw mulatto, that was denoting a Indian, man. So source, Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Almond Wheeler Lauber, 1880, page number 254. We've been basically going back to this source a multitude of times throughout the duration of the presentation. The penalty for harboring runaway slaves. In Virginia, as a measure of protection to property rights upon a complaint of damages committed by Indians, the Assembly voted in 1660 that the plaintiff in the case be given the right, provided satisfaction were not made, to sell as many Indians out of the country as the court may prescribe. So, if the Native Indians were found fraternizing with slaves or taking slaves, this was the judgment, that they could sell these Indians out of the country. It says another act of similar character was passed in 1722 after the Treaty of Albany, when the Assembly noted that no Virginia Indians should cross the Potomac River and that none of the 5 nations of their allies should go beyond that boundary. Any offenders were to be punished by death or to be transported and sold as slaves. In Massachusetts, also the question of runaway slaves who sought refuge among Indians led the General Court, June 2, 1641, to pass an order by which it was declared to be the mind of the court that if the Indians sent not back our runaways, then by commission of the governor and any 3 of the magistrates to send and to take so many as to satisfy for the want, meaning the lack of them, and for the charge of sending for them. The order, like that of the Virginia legislator, meant that any master might be authorized to write himself upon the Indians for the wrong done him by them. And that source is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Almon Wheeler, Lauber, 1880, page number 202 to 203. Now, this shows that if they would help runaway slaves and they got caught, they would take those Indians and take as many as they want to sell them into slavery to make it quote unquote right. Negroid Indians. In the Virginia colony, the colonial legislation often used the categories Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes to describe free and enslaved people. For example, Chapter 23 of a 1705 statute, which defines slaves as real estate, referred to all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves. A 1723 statute that established a number of free people as tithables referred to all free Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians. That the blood stay pure is the source, by Erica L. Coleman, page number 68. Black ambiguity. So we have a black ambiguity between Native Indians and Negroes because they were both considered at the time and in multiple epochs, multiple situations as looking alike and being the same, right? So it says, as the California Supreme Court declared in 1854, the word black may include all Negroes, but the term Negro does not include all black persons. I want you to really ponder about that. It says often the term Negro included the people of American Indian ancestry as well. Let me read that again. Often the term Negro included the people of American Indian ancestry as well. I'm going to say it again, like I've been saying this whole time. A lot of you Negroes walking around have Native Indian ancestry, don't even know it. It says this certainly was the case in the colonial and antebellum Virginia. In 1670, 40,000 people, including 2,000 black slaves, were reported as residents of the Virginia colony. However, the colony did not have that many Africans. There was, however, a large number of Indians in that area, which likely comprised part of the population of the reported quote-unquote blacks. And we touched on this as well earlier about this Virginia Indian incident with the 2,000 slaves. The proof is that wasn't many Africans there, so majority of those quote-unquote black slaves were Native Indians. And the source is that the blood stay pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 69. The Indian and Negro confusion. And there was the Indian-Negro confusion. There were Negroes who were part Indian who lived on reservations, and Indians who had children who lived in town as Negroes. Remember, they considered Negroes. It says, and Negroes who were Indians and traveled back and forth between groups with no trouble. And that quotation is from Ralph Ellison. This is the reality that you people fail to realize because of the formal education has failed you. Our educational leaders have failed us. That's why we don't really need formal education. We need advanced education. And that's what Genesis 49 is trying to provide to the people. Advanced education. So we can bring what's been in the dark to the light. As the book of Luke suggests. The source is that The Blood Stayed Pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 64. Veracity. Let's deal with the veracity of these claims. It says the reconfiguration of the identities of African American Indian peoples and the confluence that ensued from their social intermingling had, by the 19th century, resulted in what Ellison aptly dubbed the Indian Negro confusion. Despite white Virginians' obsession with racial purity and strict anti-miscegenation statutes, such restrictions did not apply to non-white populations. Because a lot of people bring up, oh, a lot of mixing went on during slavery. Yeah, it did, between Indians and Negroes. Anyway, let's read on. It says, which comprise Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes, among other groups. While the definition of these categories would prove flexible over time and were not applied with any measurable consistency, the reality is that during the course of American and Virginian history, peoples of African American Indian or Afro-Indian descent were included in these categories throughout the colonial period. Africans and American Indians freely intermarried and cohabited, since many shared a common lot as chattel slaves or free disenfranchised citizens. So we do have a commonality here. Well, they ain't been through what we've been. Yes, they have. The source is that the blood stayed pure. Erica L. Coleman, page number 64. The commonality within racial labels. It said they also shared racial labels during the antebellum period, as Virginia identified its non-white population with terms largely associated in contemporary American society with people of African descent, such as Negro, mulatto, colored, free Negro, free persons of color, or black. It was not until 1870 that the category Indian was recognized and included on the federal census. Despite this, American Indians of whatever degree, i.e. full-blood, half-blood, quarter-blood, continues to be defined with the same racial labels as their African American counterparts. I'm going to read that again. Continues to be defined with the same racial labels as their African American counterparts. They were called black. It was called colored. They was called mulatto. It was called Negro. I'm going to say this again. A lot of you Negroes are walking around, and unbeknown to you, you have Indian ancestry. All right, reading on. It says, incidentally, with racial mingling occurring between African and American Indians during a large portion of the colonial and antebellum periods, in addition to the cross-sharing of racial labels, the line between who was American Indian and who was African American became blurred. Notwithstanding, the tendency to manipulate the racial identity of American Indians was a self-serving objective on the part of the white settler class turned American citizen to justify the involuntary appropriation of American Indian lands and to increase the slave population. And the source, that the blood stay pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 65. Here's more proof that they considered these native Indians as Negroes. This is Negros da. It says, recording the use as a descriptor for American Indian people, Europeans often refer to the indigenous population of their various colonies as Negroes, or Negros, right? For example, in the Portuguese colony of Brazil, Indians were called Negros da terra, meaning Negroes of the land, and Africans were called Negros da Guinea, meaning blacks of Guyana. It said, at times, Portuguese authorities used the terms Indio and Negro interchangeably when referring to native populations of Brazil. This practice continued into the early 18th century. However, by the mid-18th century, when slavery in the region became increasingly Africanized, the Portuguese authorities issued a decree that the term Negro would no longer be used for Indians, but for African slaves exclusively. By this time, many of the Negros da terra were mixed bloods. So even more evidence and proof, right? No vague interpretation. We did what? We thoroughly broke this down. And the source is That the Blood Stay Pure by Erica L. Coleman, page number 68. Native Indian and Negro treatment. The treatment of Indian slaves apparently differed in no essential degree from that of the Negroes. The slaves of the two races lived and worked together, but since the Negroes are often in the majority, the treatment of slaves in general was determined by the ordinary usage which the whites accorded them in particular. So these people were treated the same pretty much. Native Indian and the Negro treatment. And the source is Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Almond Willard Lauber, 1880, page number 250. So they were treated, again, they were basically treated on the same level. Stock on Wall Street. A slave market was erected at the foot of Wall Street, where slaves of every description were for sale. Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes, men, women, and children, the old, the middle-aged, and the young, all as sheep in shambles, were daily declared property and sold to the highest cash bidder. And the source is History of Negro Race in America from 1619 to 1880, Volume 1, Negroes as Slaves, as Soldiers and Citizens by George Washington Williams, page number 125. So Negroes, we haven't, that's again, that common trope of chattel slavery. We share that history. Being sold together on Wall Street. It's right here. It's on the black and whites. We go about the evidence, man. That's what we go by. Now, the last tidbit of this presentation, we're going to deal with the destruction of Indian ancestry. Walter Ashby Plecker was the first registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, which records births, marriages, and deaths. He accepted the job in 1912. For the next 34 years, he led the effort to purify the white race in Virginia by forcing Indians and other non-whites to classify themselves as blacks. It amounted to the bureaucratic genocide. And the source is The Black and White World of Walter Ashby Plecker, Warren Fish. And now today, these same people are fighting to become a recognized tribe, and they can't because their ancestry and their historical records that ties them to the Indians were all distorted by this, by this tyrant. That's the word. There we go. This tyrant. Next slide. Plecker's list ruined Native ancestry. Negro Indian removal. It says, from the grave, Plecker is frustrating the efforts of Virginia tribes to win federal recognition and a trove of accompanying grants for housing, health care, and education. One of the requirements is that the tribes prove their continuous existence since 1900. Plecker, by purging Indians as a race, has made that nearly impossible. 6 Virginia tribes are seeking the permission of Congress to bypass the requirement. This is the great evil that this man did, man. They can't even receive benefits. It's for the people to even fix your mouth to try to justify this. Shows you that you lack integrity and you lack character. But again, the source for this is The Black and White World of Walter Ashby Plecker by Warren Fisk, the Virginian pilot, August 18, 2004. And we're getting ready to wrap it up. First slave rebellion ever recorded, right? It says in 1522, Europeans in the Americas first learned that slavery did not easily lead to enormous wealth. On Christmas Day, African and Indian slaves on a plantation owned by Diego Columbus rose and murdered their masters and overseers. Nearby Native Americans joined the rebels. The beautiful island of Hispaniola shook with the first recorded slave rebellion in the New World. And the source for that is Black Indians, William Katz, page number 33. And Lord will, sometime in the near future, I can actually cover his book extensively and do an overview on Genesis 49ers. All right, let's deal with the conclusion and let's wrap it up. We dealt with Native Indian slavery and how it was an impactful part of history that has been in obscurity for years. Today, we unlocked those keys and we brought it to the world of YouTube and to the viewership. And hopefully this enlightened you and opened your eyes. Hopefully you took notes, wrote down the sources. Hopefully books will be purchased after this and you continue to do the work and research so you can become an educator and edify and build the nation. We talked about the Negro and Indians and how they share a common ancestry and a plight, which is the chattel slavery that we kept bringing up. We talked about the Negro and Indian. They share the same derogatory labels and names: black, Negro, mulatto. They share those titles. This presentation was constructed to edify and encourage those who are seen as Negro and Indian to unite as one people, seeing that our ancestors share this common history. Because we all are one, and what we're trying to do, again, this channel is Hebraic. We're trying to bring back the ruins, rebuild the ruins of David, which is the 12 tribes of Israel. It says Native Indians and Negroes are Israel of Yasharel. That's the purpose. We wanted to show you this common history through prophecy and through the literature to raise the ranks, so to speak, and spread awareness and enlighten you and bring you to the truth and to your nationality, and show that we're not a different people, but we're a people of similar and common ancestry. And with that, I conclude the lesson. I pray that this was insightful. I pray that you guys learn. Leave a like on the video. Comment down below about the content. Any questions you may have, comment down below. And just let me know how you felt overall about this video. If you have anything interesting you want to add, leave in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel. You guys have been awesome with the subscriptions. We're at about 7.3 thousand subscribers. You guys have been watching the video, so I know you guys have been sharing it. Share this video as well on the social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Let's get this truth out there, family. And with that, Genesis 49ers signing off.